Your faith is false. It's all self-deception. Diana's voice bounced off the walls of my house, laden with a hatred that did not seem to belong to her. Her eyes were different, cold, distant, almost dull. A chill ran down my spine when she grabbed my Bible and threw it to the floor. I felt as if something invisible had invaded my sanctuary. In that moment I recognized it. That fury was not coming only from my daughter. It was something else, something hiding behind her words, manipulating her. I breathed in and kept steady despite a crushing pressure in my chest. Diana was my blood, my little girl who had grown up hearing my prayers. What was happening to her now was far beyond a simple crisis of belief. My heart ached, but I knew I could not step back. My name is Teresa Ferreira. I have walked with God for 68 years, even when the road felt impossible. I lost my husband Carlos 5 years ago, and since then my days have been small and steady. I rise before dawn to pray. I make coffee while old hymns play softly on the radio. I volunteer a few hours at the church where the faces are familiar and kind. I keep simple rhythms. I fold the laundry with a prayer tucked in each shirt. I water the plants at noon and read a psalm at dusk. I write letters to people who cannot leave their beds. These are my hands and my time, and through them I try to give thanks. My home is an old house of sounds. The floorboards sigh in the night. Light spills differently through the curtains depending on the season. There is a small corner with a worn chair and a stack of Bibles, one for every stage of my life. Each Bible has a story folded into its margins. I have always believed that faith is patient and quiet. It does not demand proof at every turn. Faith bides its time like a steady flame that refuses to be blown out. That was how I taught Diana. That was how I lived. Diana was my pride. She studied history, pursued questions, loved details. She taught students to see past dates and into lives. She could argue a thesis and then sit with a grieving neighbor as if nothing else existed. She loved learning, but she loved people even more. Still, change came like a slow weather. At first it was small things. She missed a Sunday lunch. Then she began to make sharp comments about my spiritual naivety. Her voice grew tight when I spoke of prayer. She used words like delusion and conditioning, as if they were badges of honor. I noticed other signs that did not have names at first. My garden, once lively, started to lose color. Roses dropped petals even in mild weather. Family portraits that had sat straight for years turned face down on their own. There was a smell sometimes like burnt rubber or sulfur that settled in corners after Diana visited. It stayed in the air until I opened windows for hours. One night at 3 a.m. I woke uneasy, called to kneel by the bed, and felt the room heavy as if wrapped in a blanket. The air seemed thick and hard to breathe. I whispered, "Lord, give me discernment. Something is wrong with my daughter." I heard a clear whisper then, a voice that was neither mine nor hers. "It is not her. It is what is with her." The words were a steady stone in my heart. They were not an accusation, they were a map. I have always believed that God speaks in small, certain things. I remembered him, a sudden peace, the precise line of scripture that opens like a key. This moment felt like one of those keys. It told me that my daughter was not simply rebelling. She was being used. I began to catalog memories like evidence. When Diana was small, she would come to me with scraped knees and say, "Mama, pray." I would take her hand and ask God for healing, and the swelling would fade as we walked the block to the pharmacy. When Carlos died, Diana sat between us at the funeral and said softly, "I can feel God here." That memory was a lighthouse in the storm that came later. Grief had taught me endurance. Loss had not hollowed me, it had steadied me. I had burned letters and kept the smell of his handkerchief because memory can be a prayer. I had taught Diana to see God as a presence in pain, not as an answer to a test. I would need that teaching now. My home is full of small holy things. A rosary in a drawer, a prayer shawl draped over a chair, hymnals with old notes in the margins. I do not parade these. They are quiet anchors. I keep them because faith needs a shape in the world. When Diana's visits grew shorter and sharper, the quiet anchors felt threatened. A child's Bible I kept on her bed when she studied fell to the floor like a challenge. I began to notice how her laugh changed around certain men. There was a distance that had the feel of electricity, an invisible wire tightened between her and something else. I sought counsel at church without making a spectacle. Pastor Gabriel listened with his hands folded. He did not flinch at the word possession, but he also did not jump to it. He said, "Discernment comes slowly. Pray and prepare, Teresa." That was all the confirmation I needed. The house itself began to feel different. Night noises multiplied, doors that sighed open without wind, the tap dripping when no one used it. My cat, who once curled at my feet, began to stare at empty corners with the vigilance of an alarm. Shadows moved like memories that would not sit still. I started to do what I learned long ago. I cleansed my spaces. I swept each room slowly, imagining the sweep of a hand across the invisible. I opened windows until the house tasted like rain. I lit a candle in the chapel corner and watched it stand firm against drafts. For a moment I thought of a candle resisting a wind and remembered that light can choose to remain. Where there is light, darkness disperses. I spoke with friends quietly. Marta came and sat with me for hours, her presence a steady warmth. Lucia brought soup and stayed to pray. Clara came with oil and a quietness that felt like armor. We spoke in low voices, measured and careful. One morning, as I dusted the shelf, a small thing made me pause. A photograph of Diana and me at a church picnic had a pin stuck to the corner. I could not remember ever placing that pin there. When I touched it, a memory unfurled, a phrase Diana had used on the phone, "Liberate her from the prison of faith." The words spread cold and thin like smoke. I did not confront my daughter then. I did not move impulsively. The whisper I had received guided me again, "Do not go to her. She will come to you." I obeyed the instruction like a prayer. I prepared the house for her arrival instead. I prepared as my mother had prepared for me. I washed linens, ironed old shirts, and placed a small bouquet in the room that still smelled faintly of my daughter's shampoo. I opened her Bible to the psalm she learned at 10 and left it on the nightstand. I tucked verses of comfort into pockets of garments I had sent her months before, trusting small things to be the vehicles of larger grace. I wanted to be a home worthy of a wounded child. I wanted the house to be a room in which healing could happen. So I cleaned and I waited. The waiting was a kind of prayer. I also enlisted help. I asked a few trusted church sisters to keep vigil. Pastor Gabriel began a prayer chain of 24 hours. I did not ask for fanfare. I asked for steady hands and steady voices. I wanted a quiet net to catch what might fall. One night, just before the confrontation I felt was coming, a cardinal came and perched on my window ledge. It looked at me with the unblinking stillness of an old friend. I thought of Carlos, then a presence that had become a certain affection in my bones. I felt less alone. I know this may sound like superstition to some. To me it was a confirmation, the kind that smells of home and memory. Signs speak to those willing to listen. I listened. I will say this plainly, I was afraid. The fear was a small thing underneath a far greater resolve. There is a certain dignity in standing when the world calls you a fool. I stood. If you are watching this and you have a mother or a child you fear for, know this. The first step is to believe that evil can masquerade as truth. The second step is to remain so ordinary you become trusted again. The third step is to prepare a place of return. If you would like to walk with me through the rest of this story, please subscribe. I am starting this channel because real stories like ours need a place to land. Help me reach 1,000 subscribers so these testimonies can be heard. Tell me where you are watching from, city and country, and share a little of your own faith. I waited. The house waited. I prayed in the soft hours. My hands, steady in their chores, were ready to hold a returned child. Nem toda sombra e silencio. The air can change and the heart can still know direction. I did not know how far this would go. I only knew what to do next: prepare, pray, and receive. The week after that tense lunch, Diana arrived at my door with a package. She carried it like a gift and smiled like a stranger. The statue inside looked wrong to me at first glance, and I said so with the caution of someone keeping an open door. "It will look lovely on your shelf," she said in a voice that tried for warmth. I put the statue on the mantel because a mother keeps her face soft in front of her child. Later, alone in the sink, I washed the statue under the tap. Symbols carved at its base caught the light and did not look like anything I had learned in church. My fingers trembled slightly as I rinsed them away. That night the house sounded different. Doors clicked and settled as if someone had walked through their own arrival. A teacup slid from the edge of the counter and clinked into silence. My cat prowled the corridors and stared into air like someone expecting a doorstep visitor. At breakfast with Beatrice I mentioned the statue and the strangeness. She lowered her voice and told me about Raphael. "He has a reputation," she said. "Some students avoid him. There are stories about rituals at late gatherings." Those small words fell into me like cold rain. They made sense of the little oddities I had been gathering like pebbles. The books Diana now carried, the abrupt endings of phone conversations when I entered a room, the sleeves hiding a new mark on her arm they fitted together. I wanted to confront the truth and keep my daughter safe. I wanted to rip off the veil and show her what was happening. But the whisper that had come in the night held firm: "Do not go to her. She will come to you." So I watched in other ways. I visited the university unpredictably, intending only warm encounters. I wrote letters and slid them into parcels. I wrapped verses in sweaters and hoped they would rest against her skin and speak to some sleeping part of her. On one of my surprise visits to Diana's apartment, I found evidence that felt like an accusation. The photographs of me with pins, the half-burned black candles, the ledger with scrawled instructions titled, "Free her from faith," they were terrible, not because they were shocking but because they tied my daughter's name to a plan. I remember stepping back from that doorway as if I had been pushed. I did not take, and I did not shout. I closed the door and walked home with a kind of hollow conviction. The world had shifted. The enemy does not always appear in monstrous robes. Sometimes it comes in a lover's voice and promises. That night, the house crowded me with its noises. The clock ticked too loud. I found myself cataloging each sound as if it might be a signal. The portrait of Carlos on the wall seemed to lean a little closer, and I spoke to him aloud as one speaks to a pillar in the dark. "Keep us steady," I said. "Guard the child who does not yet know she is lost." A micro-conflict grew between neighbors as well. Mrs. Almeida, who had once been a friend, began to avoid the stoop where we used to trade gardening tips. She crossed the street when she saw Diana at my gate. There was gossip, small and sharp, that carved at the normalcy of our street. This petty division made my soul ache because spiritual battles often press upon human relationships and rend them like paper. Where there is light, darkness disperses. I also had a quiet clash with one of Diana's colleagues. He came by with questions about research and then hesitated at the sight of the statue on my mantel. He asked, "Is she well?" in a voice that carried both concern and a judgment that almost cut. I answered with the plainness of a mother, "She is my daughter. I will stand with her." These domestic tensions mirrored the bigger war. Small fractures in neighborliness, furtive glances in the market, unreturned invitations to coffee, they all bore witness to the ripple of harm. The enemy often works by corrupting the ordinary. Still, there were gestures of grace. A student left flowers at my gate without signature. A woman from church sent soup and asked to be included in prayer. These small acts were the mortar between stones. They held me together. One evening, a letter arrived with no return address. Inside, a single hair tied with red thread and smelling of something sour and old. The note simply said, "She will be yours no longer." It was a crude thing, meant to frighten. It did. But fear can also be a teacher. I took the hair to the kitchen table and folded it into a paper that contained a verse. It felt both foolish and necessary. My mother would scold me for being sentimental. My heart had other plans. I began to watch for patterns of darkness and light. Certain songs would stop mid-verse on the radio. The lamp in the hallway would flicker when Diana's name was spoken nearby. I marked these as signs in my diary and prayed for clarity. There were also ordinary evenings, the kind that held us like a familiar garment. I would cook and set a second plate as if Diana might walk through the door. For a moment, I would pretend the past was safe. Then the phone would ring with a terse message and the pretense would dissolve. On one such ordinary evening, I found a notebook tucked beneath a stack of magazines. It was Diana's handwriting, but the thoughts inside were not. They spoke of liberation and removing anchors. It read like a manual and like a betrayal. I sat with the paper in my lap and felt something inside me break and then set to mending. There is a certain grief unique to mothers. It is the grief of watching your child trade a seasoned truth for a bright lie. It is slow and clawing. It does not always announce itself with noise. It sits like winter in the bones. I decided then to act with careful courage. I would not cower. I would not scream. I would prepare. I began to collect small things that mattered: anointing oil from the church, a handful of the best bread I had left from Sunday, a rosary that had been tucked behind a drawer for years, and verses I wrote by hand that tasted of home. Action steadied me. Prayer steadied me more. I fasted intermittently. I spent long hours in the chapel corner, palms open and a psalm on my lips. The vigils were not showy. They were small and stubborn, like a garden kept through frost. I noticed the subtle shifts in my own body. My hands steadied. My voice found its old tone of quiet resolve. I learned to breathe through the panic that rose when a car stopped in front of my house and then drove away. I learned to sit with the not knowing. The more I prayed, the more I felt a presence that was not mine but that was near. Sometimes it came as a warmth in the chest, sometimes as a phrase that would enter my head that I had not thought in years. These were the small gifts that sustained me. Prayer is not always loud. It is often patient, I would say to myself. I also spoke with Diana's few close friends. They were frightened and ashamed. One young woman confessed she had been pressured into attending a circle by Raphael. She cried when she spoke. I listened, not judging but collecting the map of how my daughter's path had been bent. There was also an argument with a neighbor's son who accused me of meddling too much. He used the word control, as if that settled the matter. I did not argue with him. I chose instead to show him that. I remember touching her hand. The skin was cold. When I touched it, she recoiled as if at a burn. The sound that rose from her was not a word but a deep, hollow moan that pressed against the walls. I took the stance of a woman who had learned to meet fear with quiet edges. I said aloud with simple force, "In the name of Jesus Christ, the influence on my daughter break now." She arched as if struck and fell to her knees. Convulsions shook her in a way that broke my heart. I called out verses, not to impress but to stake the air. I placed my hand on her and felt a resistance like a tide. I pulled on my faith as if it were a rope. After an hour that felt like an ocean, she came to herself. Tears rained down her face like released rain. When she looked at me, her eyes were raw and small with apology. "Mama." "What happened?" she asked in the voice I had raised to cradle and scold. I had crossed a line of fear and found mercy there. I had placed myself as a channel and a shield. The house that had been a quiet altar became again a room of rescue. When she slept later, exhausted, I sat by her bed and watched the slow rise and fall of someone relearning their breath. I thanked God with simple words, "Thank you for the return." But there was still Raphael, still the network that had tried to twist a daughter's love. The night had given me a victory and a warning. The battle had not ended. Small gestures of kindness came after. A neighbor brought bread. Pastor Gabriel visited quietly and placed a hand on my shoulder. In the morning, Diana apologized in fragments, ashamed and bewildered. We began the work of repair with small steps. I did not demand explanations in a flood. I asked for truth in pieces and listened to what was given. She told me of ceremonies and unlockings, and of promises that shone bright until they cost too much. There was the slow return of ordinary things. Her laugh returned in small measures. She began to attend church on Sunday quietly, and she helped me with the garden as if reclaiming a handshake. I learned that redemption is a quiet labor. It is not the spectacle of a single punished villain but the slow mending of trust. We sewed our life back together thread by careful thread. Still, I kept watch. A mother cannot unlearn vigilance. I told Diana how the statue had to go and she agreed. We buried it at the edge of the garden after prayer and a small salt ritual. The air in the house lifted a little like the lid off a pot. I do not pretend the scars are gone. They are folded under the skin and surface sometimes like a seam. But the worst of the noise had passed into a new kind of quiet, a quiet that tastes of both sorrow and gratitude. So I continue to shop, to pray, to fold laundry, and to set an extra plate. I continue to live the small rhythms that make a life a covenant rather than a performance. I learned that faith is not a thing to prove but a place to stand. If you have ever felt the air change in your home, tell me. Leave a comment with your city and country. Tell me a memory of a verse that held you steady. We are not alone in these rooms. Where there is light, darkness disperses. It was a Sunday that smelled of roast and rain. The house felt like a held breath. Diana arrived with him at her side. He smiled easy. The smile did not reach his eyes. When he took my hand it was cold, like stepping into a shadow. He sat too close. He touched her arm with a precision that spoke of rehearsal. His fingers hovered as if steering conversation by muscle. I watched the way she answered him. Small nods. Pauses time to fit his sentence. Her laugh arrived like a rehearsed note, thin and precise. The room had light, but the light felt filtered. It slipped around them and pooled elsewhere. Sometimes the air itself seemed to stiffen between us. When he mentioned my devotion it was gentle cruelty. Comforting, he said, as if pity were an indulgence. His words had honey under a knife. Diana's voice changed then. It grew flat, like a record scratched at the same line. "She thinks prayers fix everything," she said, the sentence made brittle by whatever rode inside her. I slid my hand under the table and found the linen my mother embroidered. The thread was warm from the sun. The stitch kept my fingers steady. I did not answer his disdain with heat. I answered with the steady rhythm I have practiced for decades. "Prayer does not always change circumstance," I said softly. "It changes us." He laughed into his wine. The sound was too loud for the table. He feigned clumsiness and let the glass tilt. Dark wine spread like a bruise across the cloth. The stain flamed against the white. "Perhaps your God can dry wine," he mocked, playing at theatrics. His eyes flicked to Diana. They shared a private script. When I rose for a cloth, he reached for my wrist. His grip was firm and cold. The skin beneath my sleeve prickled as if a draft had found bone. "She is under my influence," he whispered, low enough for her not to hear. His words were meant to sit in my bones. "She will obey." I felt the room narrow into the size of a palm. The neighbors' voices seemed muffled. Outside, the gutters whispered rain against the eaves. Inside, a different weather moved. His pupils dilated when he looked at me. For a second there was no charm in his face. It was a face filled with an absence that was almost animal. I saw a passage open where a man should be. I called the sight by its true name in my mind. Force. Channel. Not all harm takes the shape of a human will. Some things move through a human body like wind through glass. I kept my voice small. I refused to feed spectacle. "You speak as if you own my child," I said. "But you do not own her heart." The look he gave me sharpened. It promised a ledger of things he considered owed. Diana's fork clinked against her plate. The sound felt small and fragile. She stood up abruptly. Plate scraped. Her chair skated. She knocked a dish to the floor and it burst porcelain like a small gunshot. The sudden noise reverberated through me. It was a sound of breaking that mapped onto my chest. "Let's go," she said. The voice was hurried, a winded rhythm. She moved as if pulled by a cord. I watched them leave. The door closed with the finality of a verdict. The room that remained smelled of spilt wine and rosemary. The cat nosed the spill and recoiled as if it tasted iron. I gathered the broken shards slowly. Each piece cut the pad of my finger. The pain kept me present. I wrapped the shards in a kitchen towel like a small reliquary. I thought of my training as a woman of prayer. I thought of the night voice that had told me, "It is not her." I had learned to listen between breaths and to treat what I heard as a map. I walked the house after they left. The hallway lamp hummed a quiet complaint. Behind the curtains, the garden felt like a held secret. I laid hands on each doorframe as one might bless a doorway before a traveler. Neighbors came by later with notes of concern. Mrs. Almeida avoided looking at my eyes and offered gossip instead of comfort. Her words landed like sheepish pebbles. Small, speculative, enough to bruise. There was a raw current running along our street. People took sides without knowing the war. The grocery clerk no longer smiled with the old ease. The world had learned to tilt. At church that week there were glances and a polite silence that was almost a scolding. A small group whispered that perhaps I was being dramatic. Others nodded and kept my hands in prayer. The congregation itself felt like weather. I began to catalog more evidence. An extra lock on Diana's apartment door. A smear on my mailbox that looked like soot. A photograph of us at a picnic that had a needle stuck in its corner. Each small thing seemed to say that her confession landed like a small stone. It made a ring that spread into the world I knew. Students had been pulled, too. The net was wider. That evening I sat at the kitchen table and wrote a list. Each action on that list was a prayer. Call Pastor Gabriel. Ask him to start a prayer chain. Remove the statuette from the mantel. Wash the cups that had been used at that lunch. Send letters to Diana in envelopes beneath her sweaters. I folded the list into my breast pocket. The paper warmed against my heart like a promise. I also began to prepare in another way. I fasted intermittently, sometimes a single day, sometimes two. Hunger sharpened my prayer. Thirst made my words thin and precise. I felt the body and the spirit line up. My friends and I performed small rites in the house. We sprinkled salt along thresholds. We read psalms aloud. We anointed corners with oil. The actions felt humble and strong, like mending with needle and thread. At night I dreamt of my mother again. She would sit by the window and hum an old hymn. Her hands were calloused and steady. In the dream she would press a hand to my forehead and say, "Hold the line." I awoke each time with the image of a boundary in my mind. A line drawn around the people I loved. It felt like a mission. And yet doubt pressed at the edges. Some voices in the church suggested patience. Others suggested therapy. People recommended professionals. They meant well. They offered help shaped by their own frameworks. I did not dismiss them. But I knew this was not a case for only science. There was a seam in the world where two realities met. I stood with one foot on each side and tried not to stumble. At the end of a long week I found a small package on my porch. Inside, a lock of my own hair tied with a red thread and smelling faintly of smoke. No note. Just a message. Two simple items, belonging and warning. I took the lock to the sink and wrapped it in a psalm. I said aloud what I had said in secret, "You will not have my daughter." My voice trembled and then steadied. The words felt like stakes driven into the ground. I wrote the name Raphael on a folded napkin and kept it under my Bible. There is a strange comfort in naming. To name is to refuse the erasure of truth. The town began to feel smaller. Conversations curved away when I walked into a room. The air held the static of expectation. I learned to breathe slow and keep my hands busy. I had been taught to see the world as a tapestry. Threads fray, knots come loose. But a patient hand can repair what seems irreparably torn. I will not make war. I will make a home that is a refuge and a hinge. The house will be a place of return. Tomorrow I would go to Diana's apartment again. I would not go to accuse. I would go to leave a sweater with a verse sewn into the seam. I would go to open a small door and wait for her to step through it. I set the napkin with his name under my Bible and closed the book. The candle guttered for a moment and then stood tall. Where there is light, darkness disperses. I slept with the Bible under my pillow and woke with a clarity like the break of cold dawn. The battle had been revealed. The enemy had a face and a channel. The next step would test everything I had learned about patience and prayer. I did not yet know how Diana would respond. I only knew I would not go to her with accusation. I would go with a prepared home and a waiting heart. Outside, a low rain began to fall. The sound was like a benediction. I set my hand against the window and said one simple line, "Come home." The house listened. The house kept its light. The nights that followed were a slow erosion. I kept watch with candles and soft hymns. I spent long hours naming what frightened me. My sleep became a succession of small awakenings. Often at 3 a.m. I would sit up and feel the house breathe. The floorboards were a language I had come to know. They sighed different notes depending on who was awake. Objects moved in ways that made no sense. A cup would be on the counter where I knew I had not left it. A photograph would be face down. My cat stared into corners and would not be comforted. He seemed to see a path I could not. I went to the university one afternoon and sat on a bench beneath plane trees. Students passed like a river that did not notice the stones in its bed. I watched their faces for fatigue, for strange new conviction. A young woman I had once seen at church, one of Diana's students, approached with a paper tucked into her hand. Her knuckles were white. "They meet at night," she said. "On the terrace. He calls it opening. They burn things. They chant." I thought it was harmless at first. Listening to her, the air between us felt thinner. The words arranged themselves into pattern. Ritual. Pressure. Promise. The language of manipulation. I also felt the weight of judgment at the church. Some folded eyebrows into sermons when my name was spoken. Others prayed in secret. The community that had once been a harbor felt divided, like a small boat rocked by unseen waves. A small conflict with a neighbor landed like a bruise. Mrs. Almeida crossed the street when she saw Diana's car. We had coffee once a week and traded tomatoes and recipes. Her avoidance made me mourn something ordinary. "People are afraid," she said, when she could not avoid the subject. "They don't want to be seen with you now." Her fear felt contagious. It made me question whether my zeal isolated others. I had to guard my own heart against bitterness. Bitterness would not free my child. I realized I was holding two truths at once. The world demanded explanation. Faith demanded trust. I would not deny the facts and I would not abandon the light. One night a note arrived with no stamp and no return. A single sentence on thick paper: "She will not be yours soon." The words were a small, blunt thing. Threats like that are meant to shrink you. Instead, I folded the paper into my Bible and said a psalm. My hands learned to move despite the tremor in my chest. I ironed the sheets. I washed the curtains. I prepared the spare room with a tenderness practiced over decades. Each sweep of the broom felt like prayer. I wrote letters to people who could not leave their beds and slipped the verses I had been given into the folds. Doing small things steadied me. Action is a prayer that takes the shape of hands. At the same time, I kept a private ledger. Every oddity, every insult, every bruise in the garden was written down. Dates and times. Names. Observations. The ledger would be a record, not an indictment, but it would hold truth when memory blurred. I began to fast again, trembling sometimes from hunger and sometimes from yearning. The empty stomach seemed to sharpen the ear for a whisper that might otherwise be drowned in routine comforts. There came a night when the radio fell silent mid-hymn. The speaker made a click and then a hush. The silence in the room felt like a presence clearing its throat. I reached out and turned the dial back. "Where there is light, darkness disperses," I said aloud, the phrase a small armor piece I repeated like a bead on a rosary. The more I prayed, the more I felt accompanied. Not by noise, but by the small tilting of the world toward mercy. A phrase would come into my head that I had not thought of in years. A scent my husband's aftershave would flare briefly in the hall. These were confirmations, small and patient. I also sought more information. I spoke quietly with Diana's colleagues. They were ashamed, frightened, ashamed again. One confessed to being twisted into attending a circle under pressure. Her confession came with tears. She said she felt convulsions shook her small and great. The sound she made was raw and animal, and in that rawness I found both terror and hope. The hour stretched long. I called to the scriptures as if they were a net. I read psalms aloud, not in loudness but in claim. I laid my hand on her head and felt something push against my palm like a tide. I held the tide. Time during that hour was like a bowl of water poured slowly. The edges shimmered with memory and with a strange violence. At moments she would laugh an ugly, tearing laugh, and at others she would cry the name of her father like a prayer. I repeated lines I had learned as a young mother. I called on the presence that had always been with me, mercy, truth, the patient light. I named what had been done in small measured words so the language could cut like a seam. After an hour that felt like an ocean, exhaustion folded her down and she slept. Her breathing came back to the slow rise and fall of the child I had held. Tears lay on her cheeks like rain puddles. When she woke she was bewildered and ashamed. The first words out of her mouth were small as if she had been forced through a narrow space. "Mama," she whispered. "What happened?" I held her as I have held many small things that needed mending. "You were used," I said. "And you are loved." The confession spilled in pieces then. She spoke of herbs burned in lunar light, of bitter drinks, of promises shaped like gilded cages. She told me how Raphael had spoken of opening, of light beyond the veil, and how that light had gradually been replaced by whispers that severed memory. She wept and then laughed with a small surprised sound. "I can't believe I was fooled," she said. "I thought I was choosing. I thought I was strong." "You were chosen," I answered. "But you are not beyond returning." We slept that night in the same room. She held my hand and I folded into the old rhythm of prayer before sleep. The dawn came with a quiet mercy. But the war was not over. Raphael's presence remained like a pulled thread in a sweater that could unravel again. When there is removal of one knot, the web can retie itself elsewhere. A knock came at the door later that morning. Raphael stood in the rain like a man who had been wearing another face and now felt the seam. His eyes were glassy. He demanded to know where she was. Diana stepped forward with a steadiness I had not seen in weeks. She looked at him and did not flinch. "She's here," she said. Her voice did not carry scorn. It carried a new boundary. Raphael pushed forward and struck the threshold like a man testing a wall. He tried to enter, but something halted him. The air seemed to crease at the doorway and refuse permission. He stumbled, baffled. "What's wrong?" he cried. "What is your trick?" I stepped to the door. I did not shout. I slowly said what the house had been telling me in small currents. "There are protections here," I said. "There are hands committed to prayer. You are not welcome if you intend harm." For a long breath he looked at me with an emotion that was not only anger. There was regret and a raw emptiness, too. For a sliver of a second I glimpsed a frightened young man, perhaps as battered as my daughter. "Maybe I can help," I offered, surprising myself. Mercy can open doors that punishment cannot. It is not weakness. It is strategy. He laughed then, a broken, small sound. "I don't need help," he snapped. He could not finish. He tried again to force himself in and the barrier at the doorway pushed him back. He raised his voice and then suddenly began to tremble. Tears came with the confusion. He seemed to be coming apart. Diana moved toward him. I watched as a scene I had only read of in scripture unfolded in our hallway. She touched his hand. You can come back, she said quietly. There is a path. In the doorway, among the wet footprints and the scent of rain, something shifted. The man who had been an instrument slid like a puppet whose strings had been cut. He folded into himself and asked me, in a voice almost childlike, "What did you do?" I did not boast. I told him the truth we had all been living. We prayed, I said. We refused fear. We remembered what matters. He sank to the step and we prayed. It was not dramatic. It was an intake of breath. It smelled like bread. It felt like a hinge closing. I learned that the enemy sometimes binds the binder, too. Redemption is not only for the sacrificed. It can be for the sacrificer. That night the house slept differently. The rooms exhaled. The cat curled at my feet and purred. Dawn came with a clearer light. But I learned a new truth: victory makes a new demand. The one who returns needs tended. Trust must be rebuilt with care. Justice must be held with mercy. We would have to walk forward with eyes open. The price of reconnection is often the slow work of mending. Where there is light, darkness disperses. After the storm, the house smelled of lemon and the embers of spent fear. We lit coffee and sat slowly as if learning how to move through a body that had been awake all night. Diana was quiet and tentative. She moved as one who had stepped back into her skin after a long dislocation. There were small ways to gauge real return. Her laugh returned in fragments, her hands relaxed when she watered the plants. We spoke in small pieces. She told me about the rituals and the promises. She told me how he had offered belonging and then replaced it with dependence. He called it empowerment, she said. It is astonishing how small the traps are. I listened and took no quick cure. Stories like hers need time to be ordinary again. They must be told slowly and placed in the world like stones to build a path. Raphael stayed for a time. He was bewildered, sometimes furious, sometimes contrite. His nights were a tangle. He would wake and speak of voices that receded with light. He apologized with a sincerity that was sometimes raw. There were practical things to do. We buried the statuette at the edge of the garden after prayer and salt. We opened windows for a day and hung clean sheets on the line. The house began to smell like fabric and sunlight, honest scents that do not lie. We arranged a plan of healing. It was mostly rhythm church on Sundays, groups of accountability, small acts of service that grounded the soul. The plan was modest. The bolder miracles had already happened. Now the work was slow. I found that forgiveness is an act of will shaped by daily kindness. Saying, "I forgive," was the start. Living forgiveness meant boundaries and days of testing trust. It demanded courage in a new currency. Raphael attended sessions with a small group of men from the church. They spoke more plainly than I thought they would. They called sin by name and then offered the language of repair. For him, confession was not a performance. It was a path out. Diana reclaimed small things first. She sat on the stoop and mended a torn sleeve. She helped me plant seedlings. She made tea for a neighbor. Each tiny act felt like a stitch. Each stitch was a promise to the ordinary. The community responded in odd and tender ways. A student who had once been distant left flowers at my gate with no note. Beatrice came with a pie and stayed to talk of ordinary things: weather, new recipes, the neighbor's tomato crop. These were small graces that acted like mortar. But not everyone welcomed the return with open arms. Some remained suspicious. Gossip is long-lived and cautious. There are those who prefer a clean narrative to a messy restoration. I learned to listen without needing their approval. Pastor Gabriel walked a careful line between pastoral care and discernment. He did not make spectacle out of the deliverance. He met Raphael with a directness that felt like a rudder. He met It felt like planting a fence around a garden to protect tender shoots. The children 2 doors down sometimes watched us with curiosity. They had seen the commotion. Now they saw pots of basil and laughter spilling out of the kitchen. Life resumed its small magic. There were slips. Once a friend of Diana's called and her voice faltered into rhetoric that smelled like old temptation. I stepped in gently, reminding my daughter of the lines we had made. Sometimes stepping in is the tenderest of loves. I learned how to steward mercy. Mercy is not indulgence. It is to meet someone at the edge of the abyss and hold a rope. Mercy says, you will be held as you cross. Months condensed into seasons. The garden, which had once been wilting, slowly revived. Roses pushed green from tired stems. The light in the living room seemed clearer. These were small signs. I did not inflate them into miracles. I called them what they were, grace. We began to tell the story not as a play of triumph but as a testimony of work. I spoke at church about watching and waiting. I spoke about love that does not withdraw in the face of shame. People listened with a kind of hunger. At times I would stand at the window and watch a cardinal land on the fence. It has become a visiting friend. I would think of Carlos and the way he whistled when he trimmed roses. The presence of the dead is sometimes felt as encouragement in the living. One afternoon Diana stopped me in the kitchen and took my hands. "Thank you for not letting me go," she said. Her eyes were steady. There was an apology wrapped there that did not need many words. I told her it was my place to be stubborn in love. Mothers are like that. We practice endurance as if training for weather. She laughed and then cried, and we mended a small part of the long seam between us. There are questions that linger. Why do the lonely fall prey? How do those who are charmed by false light return? I do not have tidy answers. I only have a few truths worn in the bones. First truth, evil often comes dressed as promise. It speaks of liberation while it binds. Second truth, the ordinary things, food, presence, prayer, are tools of salvation. Third truth, forgiveness is not a river that erases but a bridge that carries. I have also learned the necessity of limits. Love does not mean unguarded exposure. It means setting walls in love's shape so that healing people can grow without harm. At our most recent Sunday lunch the sunlight fell in a new way. It was not a miracle. It was a steady day, a small mercy. We ate together like people who had rehearsed tenderness. Diana touched my hand as she passed the bread. There was no theatrical pronouncement. There was the simple, resilient ordinariness of two people who had been through bad weather and had chosen to walk again. Where there is light, darkness disperses, I said, because I say it often and because it still steadies me. It is not a magical formula. It is a practice of attention. I still keep the ledger. I still mark days when I feel the air thicken. I still call friends and ask them to pray. Vigil is a habit now as normal as making tea. If you are watching and you have been through the kind of night that makes laughter feel dangerous, know this: the work is slow but it is real. The house rises again by small acts. The person returns by small gestures. The enemy is not endless. We do not need to shout our victory. A quiet table will do. When Diana left that afternoon she hugged me long. "Thank you for believing," she whispered. "Thank you for the patience that did not demand proof." I answered with what I have kept in my pocket for years. "Faith is not a thing to prove," I said. "It is a place to stand." The cardinal returned that evening and perched at the window as if to look in. I waved. It cocked its head as if to say, "Not all things fold under pressure. I do not presume to have every answer. I only know what works in the small luminous geometry of a home: steadiness, prayer, faithful companionship, and the courage to forgive without forgetting." So we keep our doors open with eyes aware. We set plates at the table and leave room for return. We hold fast to the hope that is patient and kind. If you have a story like this, tell me below where you are watching from. Tell me a verse that has kept you. We will not trade secrets, but we will share light. Where there is light, darkness disperses. The rain sounded like a drum roll on the roof. I opened the door and saw Diana standing there, drenched and trembling. Her hair stuck to her face, her coat soaked through, her eyes rimmed red. She pushed inside without waiting. Her hands shook as she shoved a box of childhood things toward me. "I don't need this," she said, voice brittle. "I don't need any of it." I set the kettle on the stove and called softly, "Sit. Warm yourself." She looked at me as if she expected resistance, and found none. There was a moment of fault line of silence where I could have closed the door and fled. I did not. The kitchen smelled of lemon and old wood. Steam clouded the small window above the sink. Outside, the street reflected 100 tiny mirrors of gray. When I handed her the cup, she flinched as if the porcelain burned. She tore pages from the little Bible on the table and crumpled them in her fist. "You waste paper," I said quietly. "Words are not destroyed by your hands." She laughed then, a sound like breaking glass. "Words," she said. "Words kept you safe. But words are weak." Her voice was layered, like two radios playing the same song at different tempos. I watched for the human in her. I watched for the child who had once begged for a bandage and a prayer. She was there in the way her fingers lingered on the cup rim, in a small, involuntary way. "Tell me about Raphael," I asked, not accusing, only curious. Her jaw tightened as if at the taste of a word. "He taught me to look beyond," she said. "To see energy. To be free." I kept my voice low. Freedom that destroys is not freedom. The kettle pinged as it reached a boil, a neutral little sound in an escalating scene. When I touched her wrist, the muscles jumped beneath my hand. She recoiled like someone struck. It was the old reflex, the burn when grace meets shame. "Who are you listening to, Diana?" I asked. For a second her face faltered and the girl I raised flashed through. Then the other voice smoothed over, a practiced charm. "You taught us to live in stories," she said. I chose a different story. Her words landed like stones. I thought of the prayer that had woken me at 3 a.m., of verses folded into pockets, of the little scrap of psalm in a pocket of the scarf she still wore. I thought of Marta and Lucia, of the late-night circle of hands joining in my living room. I thought of the command that came to me as clear as a bell: "Hold fast." "Do you understand why I do this?" I asked, and the question was for more than her. Why I pray, why I feed neighbors, why I sit with the sick. She rolled her eyes and spat, "Because you fear death. Because you glue yourself to stories to hide." The word fear landed in the room like an accusation. I felt it too, private and raw. Fear is a shadow we bargain with. "Fear does not make me small," I said. "It makes me careful." She slumped into a chair, breath escaping in a long thread. For a moment, she looked entirely ordinary, a woman tired of being watched. Objects moved in the house while we were there together. A spoon clinked on a plate in the next room. The lamp by the bookshelf dimmed and brightened like breathing. She stood suddenly, as if pulled by a wire, and pushed toward the bedroom. She began to throw things into the box with a kind of manic efficiency. Her motions were not always hers. Her arm would tremble, then snap into something else. When I called, my cat padded into the room and curled under the table as if to hide from the memory of noise. I read aloud, but not in a rush. Words do not have to be loud to be armor. I read psalms that named refuge and resurrection, letting each one land like a stone on still water. She arched and a sound tore up from her chest that was older than speech. I held her head in my hands and felt a resistance under the skin, as if something were pushing outward. The pressure was like a bruise in the air. Let her say what she needs to say, I murmured to those I had asked quietly to be near. There were soft footsteps in the hall. Prayers were said in a dozen different rooms, in whispers, in low hums, in the scrape of a chair. Diana's voice returned in fragments. She named memories, the dog we had, the phrase her father used to whistle when he trimmed roses. Each memory seemed to pull a rope that tightened the presence's hold, then unknotted it. You are mother, she cried at one point, and then immediately sobbed. You do not understand. I do not understand everything, I answered. But I know who you are. We held to small facts like a lifeline, a first day of school, a scraped knee, the taste of fig jam. The enemy hates ordinariness because ordinariness creates continuity that corruption cannot easily sever. At one point the voice that had been speaking through her snarled, "She will kneel like you. She will give up." I felt anger flare, not the thin heat of retaliation but a solid, cold determination. There is a righteous anger that protects a child from being lost twice. Not in my house, I said. And then, because prayer is more than words, I placed my hand on her head and claimed restoration. Air moved like a sigh. For a moment I thought I heard my husband's voice humming an old hymn through the walls. It lasted and then it did not. She quieted and then laughed in a way that made the curtains twitch. The laughter had an edge I did not want to meet. Marta slipped into the doorway, palms open, eyes steady. Clara stood behind her with a small bottle of oil. We had prepared, but preparation is not a guarantee. It is a practice. Renewed, Marta whispered. We claim renewal. We spoke the words in pieces, in small sentences, as if building a ladder. Prayer stacked like boards until breathable light fell in. Diana's body slowly unknotted. Her fingers unclenched and she looked at the Bible on the table like someone learning to read again. Tears made clean tracks down her face. When she finally spoke in her own voice, it was as if the room exhaled. Mommy, she said, tiny and astonished. What did you do? You were used, I said. And you are loved. She looked at me and the sight of her young face, made brittle by recent storms, broke something that had been tight in my chest for weeks. I prayed then not to win but to heal. There is a strange labor in watching the person you love disassemble. It is not heroism to hold on, it is duty. We tend the broken as we would tend an injured bird, with calm hands and steady breath. When night fell, she slept with her head on my lap for a long time. The house settled into the work of being quiet. Outside the rain slowed to a hush. I kept watch with the Bible open on my knee. Sometimes the pages turned in the draft like small birds. Sometimes I felt a presence that was not in her but had been with her, curious and defeated. The thing about such encounters is they do not end cleanly. There are loosened threads that must be rewoven. There are new borders to draw and invitations to accept. I learned then that confrontation does not have to roar to be fierce. There is a power in stillness. There is a power in remembering a child's scrape, a father's whistle, and the smell of fig jam. Where there is light, darkness disperses. But light also asks for work. I was learning the shape of that work in the small hours, with a daughter in my arms and friends in the hall. The night closed with a murmur of prayers. I knelt and offered thanks for the small, stubborn mercy already given. And I listened for the next sound, because vigilance had become as ordinary as breath. A knock at the door later that night startled us all. I rose, palms steady now, and opened to find only a note pinned to the welcome mat. 3 words in a hand I did not know: "She will not be yours soon." I folded the paper into my Bible and read a psalm aloud. Some threats are meant to shrink you. I will not be made small. The night kept its watch. My hands, though tired, still moved. The battle had been fierce, but the war was not over. We would sleep, and we would wake, and we would begin again. Diana slept like someone who had been given back the right to breathe. She woke slowly, fingers fidgeting with the hem of the blanket. Sunlight came thin through the blinds and painted stripes across her face. She sat at the kitchen table and drank her coffee like a pilgrim sampling a strange, known land. We spoke little at first, words muffled by the day. Her hands avoided mine as if touch were a map of what had been lost and what could be found. "I remember pieces," she said finally. "Bits that don't fit together." I listened and let the silences hold the space. Memory returns in fragments. It is not a tidy thing. She told me about the nights with Raphael, about the circle in his apartment, about the herbs and the bitter drink. Her voice would catch and then steady. It was a raw thing to hear. She confessed to nonsense and to shame, to pride and the slow erosion of boundaries. "I thought I was strong," she whispered. "I thought I chose." There was a sorrow in that sentence I had not known how to name. She had been chosen, yes, but choice had been disguised as sovereignty. I reached across and laid a hand over hers. She flinched a little and then rested. Human touch is a slow kind of reconciliation. We made a plan. Not a grand one, but a practical sequence of small things. We would attend church. We would meet with Pastor Gabriel. We would set boundaries. We would invite accountability. Raphael was another matter. He arrived at the door angry and disheveled, a man whose swagger had been stolen by weather and fear. His eyes were bloodshot and his speech came in little uneven flights. "Where is she?" he demanded. His voice cracked between command and plea. It is a curious thing to watch a person you once feared become a boy again. He pushed at the threshold and then stopped, baffled. As if the house itself had learned to say no. He tried to step forward and found his foot unsteady. "What's wrong?" he asked to the air. His bravado couldn't find purchase. It looked as if the same things that had bound my daughter were now fraying around him. I did not meet him with fury. I met him with an offer I had not expected to make. "Come in," I said. "Sit. Tell us your story." For a long moment he laughed a disbelieving sound, then he sank to the steps like a man who realizes the sea has pulled back. There was confession in his posture before the words came. "They said I would be powerful," he mumbled. "That I could make people feel bigger than themselves. I wanted to be seen." The admission was small and terrifying. Pride and loneliness often dance together until one steps on the other's toes. This was a second battlefield. It is not enough to expel a spirit and leave the person without a path. Redemption requires tending, and tending requires work. We did not speak of punishment as a first recourse. We asked questions. We listened. We offered a route, service, work, accountability groups. There would be counseling, and there would be men from the church who would meet him with both firmness and mercy. "Can you forgive me?" he asked Diana, raw and small. She looked at him as if weighing fossils, finding the old shape inside something broken. Her reply was not a blanket absolution. It was an invitation with conditions. "I will not forget," she said. "I will protect myself. If you want to walk back, walk slowly and show me the steps." Some nights were for prayer, some for conversation, others for the simple chores that act as daily sacraments: cooking, clearing, planting. A seed pushed through the soil in the back garden and made us all stop and watch. Forgiveness took shape slowly. Saying, "I forgive," was the first step. The harder work was living it through boundaries, through watching, through letting the healed person prove themselves in small tasks. Forgiveness is a slow economy. Raphael's confessions were patchy and earnest. He spoke of promises made to him, of being given a language of power to hide the empty hunger beneath. He attended groups with men who called sin by name and then taught him how to repair what he had broken. One afternoon I found Diana in the garden, dirt under her nails, smiling in a way that made the roses seem to stand taller. She handed me a sprig of basil. "This is better than anything else," she said. "It smells like home." We mourned small losses and celebrated small returns. Not everyone welcomed the reconciliation. Some neighbors kept their distance. Gossip has a long memory. We learned to live without unanimous approval. There were moments that still startled us. A scent like sulfur would flicker at the edge of the pantry and then fade. A shadow paused on the landing and then moved on. We named these intrusions and then sent them away with prayer and salt. Time, patient as it is, mended many things. The house smelled of bread and lemon and laundry. The cat reclaimed the sunbeams and slept without make-believe guardianship. Diana and I made a quiet ritual. Every evening we lit a small candle and spoke one truth aloud. Not slogans, but daily confessions. "I will call a friend. I will ask for help. I will keep my boundary." The ritual tethered us to the slow rhythm of ordinary faith. Sometimes I would catch Raphael looking at the window where the cardinal landed months ago. He would nod and hold that small sign like a talisman. It is strange how the things that comfort us can also be reminders of what we lost and what we might reclaim. One Sunday after church, we sat at the same table with neighbors and friends. We let conversation meander through weather and recipes and small victories. No trumpet sounded. No angel announced the end. Just bread, and talk, and the steady beating of ordinary life. There are quiet joys that feel like proof. A laugh that returns, a seed that sprouts, a man who sweats and says sorry every day in small deeds. These are the proof texts of a slow redemption. I still keep the ledger. I still write the odd name or the unexpected smell. Vigil became a habit like making tea. I do not pretend the story is finished. Some nights Raphael wakes and whispers and cannot find the line between past voices and present life. We sit with him then, and speak the small truths again. Mercy is not indulgence. Mercy is a rope with knots. We hold the rope and teach the hands to climb. When I see Diana in the classroom, correcting a paper, laughing at a student's joke, I feel a peace that is not naive. It is the peace of someone who has tended a wound and watched it form a scar that is useful. Where there is light, darkness disperses, I tell her sometimes, and we both smile because we both know how much work light asks of us. We learn practical things: doors with locks, a plan for who calls when a text is strange, a network of friends who will come to the house at a moment's notice. Faith without action is hollow. Action without faith is brittle. We held both. Raphael found steady work. He still grieves in small ways. He still needs tethering. But he also wakes in the morning and goes to work and returns and sits at our table and is part of the repair. The community's response was mixed. Some people knelt and prayed in secret, others kept their distance like a cautious bird. We lived with both. I do not tell this story to impress. I tell it because there is a shape to suffering and a pattern to healing. We are made by small, repeated acts, saying sorry, keeping a boundary, making a meal. One evening Diana came into the kitchen and caught my hand. "Thank you for not letting me go," she whispered. I felt my heart tilt in a way memory knows well. "It was my place," I said. "Mothers are stubborn in love." We laughed and the sound felt like a stitch. These days the light comes differently through the windows. It is not an exotic illumination. It is the ordinary, loyal kind. We keep our doors open with eyes awake. We set more chairs at the table. We leave room for return and for repair. There is still a question that lives inside me. How do we guard the lonely so they do not fall for false lights? How do we teach discernment without breeding fear? I do not have a tidy answer. I only have the method I know: steadiness, small kindnesses, honest boundaries, and the audacity to forgive in ways that heal. We are not triumphant in a shout. We are steady in a song. And in the quiet afterward, I pray more than I ever did, less for spectacle, more for wisdom. For the capacity to tend what is mended, to refuse the easy hatred, and to build a life that care might find and not abuse. 3 months later, we sat at the table with church friends and the light turned gold in a particular way. It was not a miracle, only the slow work of seasons. I noticed the way the dust motes danced and felt a gratitude that did not demand fanfare. Diana passed the bread and caught my eye. There was a steadiness now in her hand. Her laugh came without a fracture. She was learning to be ordinary again. Raphael came to Sunday service sometimes. He still spoke of nights that rose like tides, of images that woke him. Healing is a long, patient apprenticeship. He attended group meetings. He worked. He apologized with the small, daily acts that have weight. I learned several truths that time has been kind enough to lamp into me. Evil often wears promise. It calls itself freedom and masks chains. Ordinary things, meals, presents, prayer are instruments of salvation. Forgiveness is not erasure. Forgiveness is a bridge you cross with someone who has promised to walk back toward life. Boundaries are the planks of that bridge. There are risks in offering mercy. There are costs to keeping doors open. But there is also a deep reclamation in refusing to turn a person into a permanent enemy. At times I still smell sulfur at the edge of the pantry. I name it and send it away with a short prayer. Sometimes the shadows gossip at the windowsill. We answer with light and go about our work. People ask me how to watch for such things. I said, listen more than you speak. Notice where laughter thins. Ask questions with curiosity, not accusation. Discernment is a listening more than a loud proclamation. My ledger sits on the shelf. It is not a relic of paranoia. It is a book of care. If you are watching and have been through a long night, know this: the work is ordinary and the victories are small. Do not be seduced by the need for grand signs. Look for steady hands, warm bread, people who come when asked. We do not end in a parade. We end in a table spread for the next return. We end in a faith that is practical and patient. When Diana hugged me before she left for work that Monday, she whispered into my hair, "Thank you for not giving up." Her voice was steady. Her trust had been rebuilt in small, unglamorous acts. I answered with what I have carried for years. Faith is a place to stand, I said. Not a thing to prove. If you have a story like this, tell me where you are watching from. Tell me a verse that has held you in the dark. We are not trading secrets. We are sharing light. The cardinal returned that evening and perched at the window. It cocked its head as if to affirm, not all things fold under pressure. Where there is light, darkness disperses. We practice keeping the light by doing the small, faithful work again.